Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this session, which is all about ambition versus uncertainty on the journey to AI adoption, or as Alexandra Mostrous, my colleague, might put it, to use one of her favorite phrases, the difference between talking and walking. We've only got 50 minutes to get into this discussion, so I'll keep my introduction very short. Simply to say that we've got some stellar guests today to talk us through this. Dr. Michael Chui is a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, Wendy Gonzalez, CEO of Summer, David Benigson, CEO of Signal AI, all experts in their field and who can all tell us some interesting things about AI adoption and the sectors in which it is taking place. The way that we're going to do this today is that we're going to focus the session around a report that Michael has spearheaded. It's an exceptionally interesting report into the state of AI in 2021, with a particular focus on AI adoption. So it'd be great if we could start with Michael to talk us through some of the findings of the report, and then we'll turn to other panelists. But as ever, and as has worked pretty well today so far, the real joy of these sessions comes when we hear from you, from the attendees. So even as Michael's talking, go onto the chat, tell us your thoughts, your questions, but more importantly, your own points of view. What do you think about AI adoption? Where is it working? Where isn't it working? And then I'll try and weave you into the conversation. Okay, let's get going, because we've got 50 minutes. Michael, thank you very much for coming along. And great that you're here. Your report is fascinating and raises a large number of questions. But I wonder whether you can kick us off by talking us through what it is and its main findings.
Now, first of all, I want to share with the audience that, in fact, this report will be launched next week. And so there are a few people who have seen previews of this, and now more of you will hear a preview of it, but just be aware it will show up on McKinsey.com. So you are getting some privileged information. Now, I don't want to say that in the legal sense, but you're getting a preview of research that has not yet been released.
We're getting a preview of an embargoed copy of the research. That's
very good. And again, I could consume 50 minutes of talking right now, but I will not. So I'll just try to highlight a few things from our research, and then hopefully that'll get the conversation started. We've been surveying thousands of executives around the world on their use of AI for several years now. And so this is an annual thing. You know, if you want to see last year's report, there's a state of AI in 2020. One of the things that's a little bit unique about this particular edition is it's the one that really most fully captures what's happened during the pandemic. So that's a contextual factor. First of all, we continue to see adoption and impact from AI continue to increase apace. So, in last year's survey, it was the first time when 50% of our respondents said that they had deployed AI in production. This year, around 56%, it continues to increase. Similarly, the percentage of companies that are deriving a significant portion of their EBIT or attributable to their use of AI also continues to increase. So, those things are happening. So we do see this happening apace. One significant difference in this year's findings versus last year's findings is the much higher degree to which companies are using AI, report using AI in order to control and manage costs. We looked at the use of AI in order to increase revenues and decrease costs all during our survey for the number of years. We've seen that happen on both ends. But last year there was a pronounced increase in the number of companies that were attributing value to using AI in order to manage costs. We do think part of that is probably pandemic related, particularly early on when the companies really didn't know what was going to happen with regard to the various demand shocks that we saw. Another thread that I'll pull on, though, is that we continue to see a set of companies, a relatively small set of companies, that are those that are deriving the most impact from AI. Over 20% of their EBIT, of their profit, they're describing as attributable to their use of AI. We describe them as high performers. We know previously that they had a set of practices that were key to, that distinguish these companies across a number of different dimensions, whether it's the way they manage their people, whether it's the tool sets they use, et cetera. Increasingly now, what we've described as ML ops is becoming those sets of practices which distinguish these companies, their use of cloud, et cetera. But the other thing about this that we're discovering is this sense or the synthesis of it is AI is becoming more industrialized in the companies that are most successful. Let me just give you just a quick anecdote, not an anecdote, a factoid from our survey. In the high performing companies, 75% of them, when they looked at their budgeted costs or their anticipated costs for AI projects, they either met that target or were below it. Half of the companies in the rest, the non-high performers, blew their budget. It was more expensive for them to use AI than expected. So what we're seeing is that companies that are becoming better at using AI are able to use these practices and their ML ops in order to make sure that it's predictable and more efficient to use AI. And I'll finally just add one other thing. It continues to, it shouldn't be a surprise if it continues to happen, but the percentage of companies that recognize risks as relevant to them that are related to AI, and of course, if you don't recognize it, you're not going to try to do anything to manage or mitigate those risks, continues to be surprisingly low. And despite the work of Tortoise and others, to talk about these things and describe the challenges associated with these risks, whether it's everything from cybersecurity to bias and fairness, explainability, we continue to see a surprisingly small number of companies who are recognizing these risks and or doing anything to mitigate them. In fact, in some cases, we saw the percentage of companies who described these risks as relevant decline, strikingly in some cases in developing markets. So let me pause there. There's a lot I'm sure we can talk about, but I just want to give a thumbnail of some of the things that will show up when we release this report next week.
I mean, that is seriously interesting. There's so many points that we could pick up on, and I'm sure that people in the chat will want to kind of pick up on some of these points as well. So let me kick off asking you a couple of questions, and then hopefully people in the chat can come in, and I can steal their questions in order to ask you more. Just give me some context, if you might, on the kind of companies that you are asking these questions to, because presumably that's quite relevant as a starting point to assess adoption.
Yeah, it's an incredibly broad set of companies. As I said, it is global, so it spans developed and developing markets, whether it's Europe, North America, Asia, Africa, Latin, et cetera. So it is, and the size of companies also varies. It's probably not entirely representative in the sense that if you actually look at the demographics of companies in the world, there are many, many tiny ones, and they typically are not reflected as much in our survey. So our survey, is I'll broadly brush, like a third large companies, a third medium, and a third small. But by small, we're not talking about truly micro enterprises, which make up a large percentage of the actual number of companies in the world. Yeah.
And do these smaller companies, do a certain proportion of the companies that you survey not use any AI at all, or do they have to start off on the basis that they have to be at least interested in the subject?
Yeah, our results primarily reflect companies that are doing something with AI.
Okay, one of the really interesting things, because I've seen a kind of précis of the embargoed report. One of the really interesting things to me was that the overall percentage of AI adoption seems to have risen from 50% in 2020 to 56% this year, but that actually that kind of percentage wasn't sort of concentrated in one particular country or one particular sector, that you were seeing that over quite a wide range of areas. And what does that tell you, the fact that you've got 53% in Latin America and a high number in India? What does that spread tell you or tell us about AI adoption?
Well, it's a little bit of an interesting validation of other research that we had done. I mean, basically, we had a separate set of research which looked at the potential of AI in different sectors and different geographies, and we looked at hundreds of different use cases. And the top level finding there is that there is no company, no sector, and in fact, no business function, whether it's from HR through operations, through marketing and sales, where AI cannot actually add value, cannot actually help create value. And to be honest, I've said before, sometimes I feel like I'm too cynical because I actually thought that there might be, great misallocations, that in fact, people wouldn't be trying to invest in AI in places where it would create value. But what we actually find from our survey research, and amongst them, Alexi, is what you were saying, which is that if it is actually applicable around the world, it turns out people around the world are using it. And so that makes sense, and it's a bit gratifying that this recognition of its potential value really is there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, there's some more questions that I think that we should ask about the fascinating results of this survey. But I just wanted to flag that there were already a couple of interesting comments being made in the chat. So maybe I can ask a couple of questions, and then we can bring in Maria and bring in Paul Dempsey as well to ask some follow-up questions. I think Maria has a particularly interesting point to make about risk, which we'll come to in a second. But Michael, can you just talk a bit about the difference between these high-performing companies and the rest? What kind of key business practices or characteristics are you seeing in the high-performing companies versus the rest? Because I'm interested in whether it's more centered around the sort of the practicalities. The high-performing companies have more kind of cloud capacity, or whether the high-performing companies have, leaders who are more kind of obsessed with AI and more convinced of its benefits, or whether they have a better kind of talent pipeline. What are the distinguishing characteristics there?
I wish I could tell you that you only have to do three things, five things, and then you're going to be good. It turns out there are almost dozens of different practices that we identified, all of which collectively
I think
performing companies are doing better than the rest. They're doing more of it than the rest, suggesting some of them have to do with people stuff. Whether or not you actually have competent, knowledgeable leaders in the boardroom, in the C-suite, and in your management. So, but also, how do you make sure that the front line is understanding what's going on? But there's a set of technical practices as well. Companies that are high performing, that are applying ML ops, have much more automated data pipelines, have much more automated ways in order to do model risk management, identify whether or not there's model drift, and then be able to retrain their models. And so it is a whole gamut of different things. So it includes leadership, it includes HR, people management, includes data and data strategy. It includes the technical infrastructure, as you said. The cloud adoption is actually higher for these companies as well. So a whole variety of different things.
Do you get the sense that there's a correlation between companies that use more AI and companies that kind of get better at AI and are able to link AI and adoption more closely to profit generation? In other words, the more you do, the better you get?
Yes, there is number one, there's a learning curve. And so again, starting earlier allows you to industrialize better, which we've seen, but also the breadth of application, tends to be indicative. Now, you could question which direction the causality arrow points, right? Do you do more stuff and then learn how to use AI better, or are you better at using AI and therefore you can do it in more places? I suspect it's both, but we have seen the fact that the more broad application of AI within an enterprise, the more performance you get.
And just explain to us ML ops for those who don't know that term.
It's a set of practices. It's a lot like DevOps and software. You can think of other trends that we've seen in management, whether it's lean or agile. It's a set of practices. There's an emerging, tech stack, which allows things like being able to more industrialize your data pipeline, more industrialize your process of model training and all those sorts of things, but also a set of practices that are also characteristic of deploying these ML more quickly, more reliably, and as we would describe it, in a more industrial manner.
Okay, that's fascinating. I mean, well, I want to bring in our two other star panelists, Wendy and David, in a second, and also maybe even before them, Maria and Paul, who are making good points in the chat. But can we just, Michael, just for 3 or 4 minutes, talk about risk? Because it seems quite fascinating, potentially concerning, that adoption is going one way, but that risk, appreciation of risk, is not kind of traveling along that same trajectory. So what kind of risks are, I suppose, not being, properly recognized by the companies that you're surveying?
So I do think it's concerning. I do think in some ways the direction of travel is right, although we did see this anomalous result this year where actually, it's, in some cases, recognition of the relevance of these risks declined for some of them. Here's what's, concerning. While most respondents describe cybersecurity as a relevant risk, for almost every other risk that we asked about, less than 50% of companies describe them as relevant. Now, that being said, in some cases, that's actually true, right? So if you are a mining company, you might not be worried about consumer, personally identifiable information. You haven't identified PII for your employees, but you're mostly digging stuff out of the ground and moving it somewhere. And so It makes sense why that's not relevant. Nevertheless, there are a lot of companies who touch consumers. And so for them not to recognize that as a risk is interesting or concerning. Yeah.
And do you think, why do you think that is? Why do you think that they are not recognizing, for instance, why consumer-facing companies, why do you not think many of them are recognizing privacy as a risk? Is it because they think that there's no kind of regulatory structure in place that will effectively hold them to account and potentially affect their bottom line? Or are they speaking kind of more sociologically, that they don't consider what they do to pose a risk in that sort of social way?
Yeah, it appears to be a variety of different things. Unfortunately, it's not just one thing. Now, it varies from just, everything from a lack of competence within the organization to address it, or, recognition at higher levels of at different ranks of the organization, through to choices saying, I'm not going to worry about this risk because I have to worry about these risks, for instance. In some cases, it's technical understanding. Some of these risks are, of course, not just pure technical, but they involve the legal function. But the legal function might not know much about AI, and so all of these organizational challenges are possible too. But unfortunately, we didn't discover again one single thing that would be the obstacle that can unlock a better understanding of risks within organizations.
Just to pick up on that point, Maria Gonzalez, who we heard from in the first session at PwC, is making the point in the chat that the ECAI Act, being a risk-based regulation, potentially might bring home some of the AI risk agenda to these companies. Is that something you suspect you'll see in 2022, 2023?
Yes, I think it. Certainly that regulation, but many regulations around the world will force, from a compliance standpoint, for companies to address these more.
Okay, fantastic. Well, look, let's bring in a couple of people from the chat to hear their thoughts, and then we'll turn to Wendy and to David. So I'm not sure who is around first. Maybe Maria Carnovale. I probably butchered that name, in which case I'm very sorry.
You pronounce it really well, Maria Carnovale. So yes, my question was around risk, and I think in part Michael replied to my questions really completely. And the thing I was curious about is what were the reasons why these firms were not taking into consideration risk, and in a certain way, what can be done to make sure that that consideration runs parallel to the implementation of the AI application. So it's not that first we apply AI and then we think about the risks, but the two things run hand by hand.
Just before Michael answers that, Maria, do you have any? What's your thoughts on this? How can we encourage companies to do exactly that?
But, I mean, regulation is one piece of that, but one thing that we have seen is that regulation is often playing catch up, and so it's not fast enough. So I was wondering whether maybe some like soft regulatory standards, like voluntary standards might be, or a certification program might be a better avenue, even though I guess the question would be, how do we make sure that the certification is not also playing catch up?
Michael?
A couple of quick thoughts. Absolutely agree with the idea that, it shouldn't be something that ends up at the end, right? It should be part of your thinking, your processes. My colleagues who work on digital trust tell us this all the time, right? Make sure that you're thinking about these risks at the very beginning of the life cycle of any project. That's one. Two, I agree that regulation, norms and practices, right? So how is it that industries can get together and say, these are the right things to do? But the third one I think is also interesting. Another idea is insurance. Insurers might be on the hook for certain types of risks. And in other industries, we found, risk management, there are financial incentives to actually managing risk better. And so, through the insurance industry, we might increasingly see appropriate economic pressures for companies and others to manage these risks.
Which is something that I think is being talked a lot about in the cyberspace as well. Paul Dempsey, do you want to come on? Hey.
Hi.
How are you?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Not bad at all.
That's true. One thing I'm interested in basically is about supporting infrastructure, and I'm wondering, and its impact on adoption. I'm wondering if you noticed between the high-performing companies and the low-performing companies, whether the high-performing ones did a lot of custom work. They had a big AI team in-house full of domain specialists and data scientists, or whether that was a mix where you now have enough of a tool and a know-how and consultancy infrastructure that you can be high-performing without that. I mean, is it still, if you like, very much something where, okay, you might bring it in on budget, but it's a pretty big budget because you've got a very, very big team of specialists who are doing it, or is the infrastructure there to let everybody reach that level?
Yeah, this buy versus build thing is quite interesting. It's a little bit difficult to tease out in the survey because even those who have a significant amount of build capability often buy a lot of things as well, right? And accessing AI capabilities through APIs on cloud platforms, et cetera. But anecdotally, we do know that the increasing trend is for those that are really closer to the cutting edge, they do have a lot more capability in-house. And so we're definitely seeing that. We see a greater percentage of digital investments in AI from those high-performing companies. And actually, the cloud point is interesting, right? Because while in general we found high-performing companies using cloud more in our survey, we also know, from talking with a number of companies, that if you really do have a large amount of workloads in AI, that oftentimes it makes sense to go and buy your own cluster with all the attendant annoyances of that. But nevertheless, it turns out buying cycles in the cloud, if you're buying a lot of cycles, can be very expensive.
Michael, we probably should bring in some other panelists, but I just wanted to talk to you about adoption, on a non-hypothetical basis, like in terms of the sectors that you're seeing AI adoption most kind of generate heat. And I think that you mentioned in your report service operations, product service development, marketing and sales as three areas where AI adoption is most likely to be common. But could you just put like a bit of meat on the bones of that and give us some examples of the sorts of companies that you really think are kind of at the cutting edge in terms of driving forward AI adoption in these sectors?
Yeah, and maybe just to clarify a little bit, those findings were actually about the functions within companies. There are sectors that serve service operations, but service operations, for instance, is everything from customer service, right? And there are obviously customer service companies, but almost every company has a customer service function. And so this is a case where, for instance, in customer service, it might be optimizing, how you apply your staffing to make sure that you're actually meeting the peaks. Or customer service in some companies means someone driving out to help a customer, and so optimizing routing, et cetera. Those are some of the things that are there. Plus the oft talked about chatbots, et cetera, automating those types of functions. That's incorporated there as well. But if I could just throw in another connection with this other research where the potential is. Basically, what we've found is the greatest potential from AI is wherever the most value is created by the companies. And so marketing and sales levers, top line levers, are typically drivers of, for instance, retail sales. And so for those companies, things like the use of AI for next product to buy recommendations, for optimizing marketing spend, those are some of the use cases that we see. And in lots of companies, it's basically operations that drives their performance, whether it's, a miner, as I mentioned before, but also, a logistics company, for instance. And in those cases, AI applications of things like route planning, inventory optimization, decreasing unplanned downtime in a manufacturing environment, those are the kinds of use cases that, tend to have the highest return. And it turns out tend to be the ones in which those types of companies invest the most in AI.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, we've got a whole bunch of comments from people coming in, including from Grace Cassie, I think, who would be great to hear from. But let's turn to Wendy Gonzalez. Wendy, thanks for hanging on. Could you just give us an overview of what your company does and how you see the AI adoption space?
Absolutely. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and that was a fantastic overview, Michael. I look forward to seeing the full report in detail. So I'm Wendy Gonzalez, CEO of Asama, and we are an end-to-end AI data pipeline. So we basically help curate, structure, identify the data sets that power artificial intelligence algorithms. And I think as hopefully everybody well knows, it's very much a garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have representative, highly accurate data, it's incredibly difficult to get effective AI applications. The other thing beyond what we do is that we're a certified benefit corp. So I'll make a couple of comments on that. I think there's been some pretty interesting things discussed here as related to responsible and ethical AI. I'll make one comment that I do believe that this is going down the path of regulation ultimately, because there's a very big difference between designing for ethics and actually bolting them on afterwards. There are many disastrous examples in the press of what can happen when you have, biased data, as an example. But the EU did come up with ethics guidelines a couple of years ago that I think there's some information in the chat, and I'll go ahead and post that in the chat as well. But companies, and I should say governments, are beginning to think about this. One of the things, though, that I'll make note of is that I haven't heard so far in the conversation, but I think is an incredibly important one, is what about the social impact of AI? We haven't talked about that at all, and it didn't appear to be part of the overview, Michael, that you provided. So I'm very curious why that sort of hasn't kind of come about yet more as a significant thing, because beyond things like the displacement of workers, if you think about the sort of representation and ethics in AI is we have ghost workers out there that many companies are using, getting paid cents on the dollar to produce the data that is basically informing these AI applications. And if you're getting paid cents on the dollar, nameless people you don't know either where they are sort of being represented from, and if they are getting paid fairly, how can you sort of expect both representative and high quality data? So one thing I'll note is that at Sama, we pay our workforce full-time living wages. They are not incentivized based off of how many widgets that they pop in. And they are incentivized based off of accuracy and quality. And when you think about the applications that are being built, you should not only care about how are those workers being treated, so very similar to kind of like the notion of fair trade, but are they diverse? AI is supposed to be AI that works for everybody, every gender, every class, every economically diverse people. And if you don't have that as part of your consideration, how can you be sure the foundation that you're building upon is actually representative and inclusive?
Thank you so much, Wendy. We produce a tech-based newsletter called Tech State every week that I write with my colleague Luke Bedimer, and Luke has written the last couple of issues, and in the last issue he wrote very powerfully about something that Wendy, I think you're partly talking about, which is the data labeling industry and the insecurities and the problems around that. Do you feel like the way that you treat your workers in this respect and in this kind of sector is very much a minority when compared to how the majority of data labelers and the majority of people that kind of create the data that AI systems rely on are treated? And if you are in the minority, then how do we make the majority behave better?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we are in the vast minority. The majority of the data labeling industry is done through crowdsourcing. There at one point in time, there was a start of a crowdsourcer kind of code of ethics. But part of the challenge of this is that when you don't provide any, by definition, you're throwing all these activities out to a crowd. People who have no training, you don't know where they're coming from. The pay is based off of what is produced, if you will. So not only is it highly challenging when it comes to accuracy, you don't know how those workers are being treated, and they are under being paid by the task. So I think one of the most important things to really be able to address this effectively is you have to measure what matters at the end of the day. Without targets, there isn't going to be significant progress without that sort of visibility into the supply chain. I think what needs to happen, very similar to kind of developing ethical AI by design, is actually keeping this front and center for the companies that are adopting AI. So we make a point to provide transparency, that we're hiring employees, that we're paying living wages. We publish that data to our clients. And we do things like we did a randomized control trial with Poverty Action Labs in MIT to basically do a study over multiple years to be able to shine a light and provide some visibility on the targets. One thing I'll note is that we are at least 50% women. I'm sure as many of you who are adopting and hiring data scientists and machine learning engineers, it matters who's not only labeling your data, but who's building it. It's all about perspective. The use cases that you build, if you come from a very sort of narrow view, are not necessarily going to be representative. So I think it's incredibly important that not only are we actually keeping aware of this, but we're actually measuring those targets.
Okay, that's really interesting. Anya Kasparison is making an interesting point in the chat, and she says it's critical to encourage an honest scientific and political discourse on the social and anthropological impact of embedding often highly immature AI systems to perform critical functions. Michael, can I just come back to you on all this point about responsibility, particularly to people like data labelers? Is that even a risk that you asked companies about, or is it so like off the radar that it wasn't even in the survey?
There are so many other things that we wanted to ask about, and Wendy's right, we did not ask about those, but we do know, we've been involved in the Partnership on AI for People in Society, for instance, and other groups that are addressing some of these issues, or at least looking at some of these issues, and they are quite challenging. As Wendy describes, you know, some of the work in data labeling could be extractive. What's interesting is sometimes the subjects of the data labeling is also extractive. If you see, for instance, all these images that are, you know, being created in these image databases, oftentimes, you know, there hasn't been consent of the peoples whose images are in there, in addition to, you know, the representation challenges of what's actually in those images. And then obviously some of the results that you've seen, you know, Joy Balamwini and others have pointed out, have some real challenges as well. So there absolutely are a number of these additional risks, which weren't necessarily part of the set that we asked about. And I dare say the recognition of those challenges is probably even lower than some of the business challenges that we asked about.
And do you think that you're likely to get mainstream adoption of the sort of business practices that Wendy's company has put in place without legislation?
To a certain extent. I do think that we do see a robust discussion, certainly around the diversity or lack thereof in the technical fields in AI, and a number of actors who are trying to change that. You know, there are a number of organizations, as well as, you know, some of the employers themselves have initiatives. Unfortunately, you know, do I wish that we're moving faster? Of course. So it's a little bit of a two-handed thing. Yes, there's progress, and yes, there's so much more work to do.
Okay, well, that's a good point to throw this open to David Benigson, who's CEO of Signal AI. David, just give us your take on all this.
Thank you. Well, fantastic to be here, and wonderful to hear both previous panelists who I think spoke incredibly eloquently about this fascinating area. Maybe just give you 2 minutes of background on Signal, so you can understand, or the listeners can understand the kind of context I'm coming at it from. So I founded Signal AI 8 years ago with my co-founder, who's a data scientist, Dr. Miguel Martinez, who was finishing his PhD at the time. We founded the business in a garage, of course, here in London. So we're in good company with some other startups that were founded in garages, and really we saw this opportunity, or we saw this convergence of different trends, coalescing in the market, the explosion and velocity of data available to organizations, and yet the inability for business leaders to use the world's unstructured data to drive better decision making. The fact that organizations are exposed to more risks, more threats, more issues than ever before. The world is simply just more chaotic, but most organizations don't have effective radar to get ahead of those risks and threats efficiently for their organization. And then the emergence of machine learning and AI as a set of technologies we believe we're going to change the world, but in particular could be applied to those challenges with a view to turn those into opportunities. And so today Signal aggregates billions of data points from media and social media and broadcast, structured and unstructured data from around the world. And then we use AI to kind of extract events and sentiment, trends and patterns to then help those clients understand their environment and get ahead of those risks and threats more efficiently. And I think what's fascinating to me, when you think about adoption, and some of the things that Michael was describing in his report, from when we founded the business 8 years ago, I think, things have changed dramatically. But I think I think the journey of adoption, it's important to contextualize to be able to answer that question effectively. When we founded the business 8 years ago, AI was not even a buzzword yet. And I think the general understanding of the technology, its application and utility was very immature and fairly non-existent, particularly across corporate and the government landscape. And since then, of course, we've seen this explosion in attention and hype and funding, and the number of startups involved has grown exponentially. And there's been this rapid increase, particularly in recent years, in adoption and integration in the corporate world. I think many of the first wave of companies entering the space that I saw were horizontal in nature. They were AI as a service type businesses where the AI technology was the use case in of itself. And many early adopters were burned, in my view, corporate adopters were burned because they wanted to experiment with the technology, but didn't necessarily have a clear use case or problem that they were trying to solve. And many encountered the failed a failed IBM Watson project with a few zeros attached. I think since then, we've had this important pivot and positive pivot to vertically applied AI, where the technology is used to solve problems for specific use cases, sectors, and applications. It's not the end goal in of itself. So this idea that, there's going to be a dedicated AI team whose job it is to experiment with the technology, that's not really the right mindset or approach in my view. As these vertical applications have matured, so have businesses understanding and knowledge of being able to adopt these technologies, weave them into their workflows, and therefore inform business decision making and kind of solve specific problems. And I think this, that adoption curve has obviously been accelerated dramatically in the last 18 months, 2 years, as we've grappled with the pandemic. But I think it's important to note, it's not just COVID, it's the climate crisis, it's the race and inequality issues in America, it's the rise of ESG. We're in this very complex and disruptive cycle where organizations are struggling to get to grips with the rapid changes in their environment. And the world is moving at such a pace that being unassisted or unaugmented now leaves organizations at a competitive disadvantage. So I think, as Michael referenced, for me, we're seeing applications of AI almost in every sector, but more importantly than sector or geography, in my view at least, is it's being used to solve specific use cases and problems in every function in the organization. So whether that's supply chain risk, ESG, transport and logistics, each of these sectors are now deploying AI to kind of solve specific problems, essentially.
That's so interesting. Okay, I just have two quick follow-up questions. Then can we loop back to Grace Cassie, who I want to bring into the conversation as well. But David, two questions. Firstly, has your view of how companies are adopting AI post-COVID changed from pre-COVID? Has COVID been quite a significant factor in how adoption works, or not? And second, do you recognize, because you're kind of on the cutting edge of AI and AI adoption and incorporation, do you recognize some of the gaps that Michael and Wendy are talking about in terms of AI adoption continuing apace, but companies and corporates not recognizing necessarily the risks that are attached to that progression?
Yeah, no, great question. I think it's linked to, as I was explaining prior, the transformation has been accelerated in these last 18 months, but that's because the problems that organizations are grappling with are accelerating in these last 18 months, not just specific to the pandemic, but the just the vast array and the complexity is of the issues that organizations are grappling with, and what organizations are starting to realize as they experiment and as they adopt these technologies and as the technologies themselves mature, is that to be augmented by AI will enable them to be more competitive. And whether that feeds into accelerated revenue growth or EBITDA, or cost savings or risk mitigation, businesses are seeing these opportunities, to actually utilize the technology. And so I'm a big proponent of moving away. It's a little bit like there were internet companies 15 or 20 years ago. There's no such thing as an internet company anymore.
Right.
I'm pretty confident in 5 to 10 years there's going to be no such thing as an AI company. There's just companies who use technology to solve a problem. And so I think, my big, if I'm speaking to earlier founders who are starting to experiment, you're not building an AI company. You're building a company that's trying to help an organization solve a problem. And AI is a tool amongst many others that can be used to help solve that problem more effectively. So I think that mindset shift is very important for practitioners. It's very important for the people adopting the technology. And then you get much better results because you're actually aligning what you do with a real business problem that's actually going to have a tangible impact. In regards to the sort of kind of ethical and risk challenges that have been described, I think they're significant, and I think there's generally, from my experience, working right across government, we service over 700 global organizations, from Google to Barclays to Deloitte to the UK government. There's a lack of education and understanding about what goes in to make the sausage, essentially. And I think particularly at senior levels of organization, there historically has been an ambivalence, and now there's been a kind of rush because it's hot and it's a hot topic, and people feel like, if I have a cool AI project, maybe I'll get a promotion, I think. And so I think, again, there's a responsibility on the side of the practitioner to try and educate about some of these topics and some of these issues and risks. And then I think there's a responsibility on the side of the corporate and the adopters to hold their suppliers to account. So for example, this issue about data labeling, which is very prevalent and significant, I think is regulation going to be the answer? I think has been alluded to, I think regulation is always a couple steps behind where the technology is, and there will always be this catch up, and there's a real lack of understanding on the side of the regulator typically. But I think that there should be a social contract between supplier and client, and I think things like ESG are driving and changing the behaviors of organizations quite dramatically. And whether they're doing that for good reason or whether they're doing that because they want more funding from asset management firms, in some ways, hopefully it won't matter in the long term. But I think applying those same sort of standards and principles into the way that we work with this technology and the way it's adopted and utilized, I think will hopefully resolve some of those issues that Wendy was raising before.
Thank you so much, David. That's great. Okay, let's bring in Grace if she's around.
Hi there, hello.
Hey.
Thanks to all of the contributors so far. This has been a fascinating discussion. I feel that we're somewhat, I might be taking us back a little bit to the same discussion around risk and security, but I suppose I just wanted almost to make a plea from someone who's involved in the cybersecurity industry to please avoid the path that we have found ourselves following in cyber. I think you can make an argument to say that part of the current enormous size of the cybersecurity industry is really a product of the fact that software adoption outpaced security, and we're now inefficiently and expensively trying to retrofit security to software. And my concern, particularly, I guess, stimulated by some of the very interesting pre-highlights that Michael gave of his forthcoming report, is that the areas where you're seeing most adoption tends to be the areas where there can be most impact on the business. That's completely understandable, of course, but that therefore is not likely to see security and risk being prioritized as part of that decision making. So we've had some great input from Wendy and David on some of the things that might be done to encourage building security and risk thinking into these products and applications earlier. Michael also mentioned insurance, which I think is, I think it's part of the problem. I would caution slightly based on our experience in the cyber industry that I think insurance can sometimes be seen as a rather kind of a patch, if you like, that you stick on after the fact to try to solve your problems later. And I think that can end up with some quite perverse outcomes as we see actually with the ransomware at the moment, where almost the insurance policies, one might argue, are incentivizing the payment of ransoms. So I think we want to be sure that we don't just think that we can find some insurance policy down the line that will just solve these issues if we don't build it in the first place. So I don't think I have the answer. I think people have mentioned standards and regulation, both of which I think are going to be part of this solution. But I guess it's just a plea to those of you who are practitioners, developers, and users to think earlier about this than I think we did with software adoption.
That's so interesting. Well, let's take that and give it to Michael to see what he thinks about that point, either from a kind of personal perspective, Michael, or relating to any of the findings in your forthcoming report.
I'm not sure how much I have to add. I absolutely agree with Grace's points. One is that in many cases, adoption is racing ahead of managing these risks, of a recognition of these risks. In some ways, that is a common thing. We've seen this many times, and hopefully we can help. Hopefully, we collectively will learn from that and be able to, manage these risks by design earlier on in the life cycle. But it is, as our findings show, it is challenging. And that, just to add, to Grace's point, absolutely there are companies who think they can financialize the management of these risks by insurance at the end. But the other point that I was making is the insurance industry will put pressures on the organizations who are asking them to write policies in order to adopt practices that manage the risks better, because they don't want to pay. And so that's the dynamic that I'm hopeful will contribute. But it is very difficult because as an insurance company, as from cyber, if they don't have a whole bunch of priors, it's actually very difficult to price the policy and all those sorts of things. So it is still a process to make this work, but it's one additional incentive to try to get companies and leaders to recognize the risks and then manage them.
Thank you so much. I want to give the last word to Wendy Gonzalez, because she's made a point in the comment that I think in the chat that I think really resonates, which is, would you buy a product made by someone paid less than $1 a day? I don't think many of us on this call, I hope many of us on this call would answer that we would not. There does seem to be a story here, and a big kind of public interest in exploring this group of people who are being used as an kind of integral part of the AI economy, but who are not being looked after in any kind of meaningful way. And Wendy, I wondered if you had to kind of give us as a journalistic organization some advice on how we go after that story, where would you start?
Yeah, and I think it is a story that very much needs to be told. It is so many ramifications, not only on the social impact component, but I think the world demands this, right? You remember the days of greenwashing, right? Before ESG became a real thing. I think investors are going to start taking their money away from non-ethical sources. They're going to be focused on companies with purpose. Consumers will demand it. And I think the key thing is that we need to not only bring visibility, but we have to measure. None of this matters if we don't actually measure and hold ourselves accountable. So I think I would focus the story on not only shining a light on this, but shining a light on the complete lack of data available. And I think that's been echoed by many people in the chat. And I think that is a huge thing to consider. It's I mean, I dare say it, massive crowdsourcing and ghost workers, it's like modern day slavery.
Well, I mean, I think that is this might have started off as a discussion about AI adoption, but it's ended with a pretty good and a pretty important story idea that I'm sure that me and Luke and the rest of the Tortoise team are going to go away and think hard about. So thank you very much to Michael and to Wendy and to David and to Grace and to all the people on the chat who contributed so kind of eloquently. And I'm sure we're going to save the chat and send it to anyone who wants it. These sessions are all recorded as well. We have got, what have we got next? We've got opening the black box. Can you have trust without explainability, which is quite close to some of the stuff we've been discussing today. That is going to be hosted by Tabitha, and it's going to take place in 8 minutes. So go and grab a drink, have a little break, and we'll see you then for, is it the final session of the, no, there's one more after that, but might be the best. Okay, I'll see you later. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who came.